Just starting, hold on. Okay, so that's the recording started, just so that everybody knows.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Oh, yep. Sorry. I was just going to do a quick introduction. So for those of you who know me, don't know me, my name is Kat Calvert and I'm the workstream lead for the West Partnership. Today we're joined by Susan Doherty, Beverly Ferguson and Pauline Lynch from Education Scotland. I will let them tell you a bit more about themselves. Over to you, ladies, and I'm going to mute.
Okay, thanks, Kat, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Inclusion in Mainstream programme, where we will be focusing on parental involvement and engagement for pupils with additional support needs. So as Kat said, our presenters today will be Pauline Lynch and Beverly Ferguson, and I'll be on hand for a couple of slides and questions at the end. So I'm going to just briefly go over some of the practical points of delivering an online session. I'm sure you're all quite proficient in doing this given the last 2 years, but if we can move the slide on, Beverly, thank you very much. We would ask that you please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. As Kat says, you'll have an opportunity to speak if you do want to ask a question at the end. You can also use the chat panel to ask questions, post comments, resources, anything at all that you want to share. If you do want to talk or ask a question, please put the word speak or raise your hand and one of the facilitators will bring you into the conversation. Again, Kat did advise that the event will be recorded. So if you are thinking about putting your camera on, just be aware of that. If you lose connection, just refer to the email. That's got the joining instructions and it'll get you right back in. So lastly, we do try to make these events as relaxed as possible. We do encourage dialogue between peers, but it is online. So if we do have a few glitches, then just please forgive us. So I'm going to hand over to Pauline and she's going to give an overview of the programme as a whole.
Hi, so I just wanted to acknowledge for some of you this might be the last session within a range of events that we've had around inclusion in mainstream. They were gathered together based on what needs staff had raised. So this really, it was just to give a context for that. And to give an overview of what we're hoping to cover today, we would like to give you the context for this area, show you this key legislation and policy. And certainly I know what helped me in this area was to begin to unpick what is meant by the different terms, parental engagement, parental involvement. And I know I found that really clarified for me, what are we actually discussing? So we'll be doing that. We'll also be looking at, there's been many surveys with parents saying what are their barriers, what are their current issues. So in just in summary, some of those issues will be raised, and we will start to look at what Inquire, the specialist agency that supports parents of children with additional support needs, what do they recommend? And we will explore some practice examples.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Beverly Ferguson, and it's great to be here with you. So I'm going to start us off in some of those key pieces of legislation. And the first one that I would point your attention to is the Scottish Schools Parental Involvement Act. If you're not aware of that, that came into force in 2006. And there are three main strands within the Act. The first one is learning at home. The next one, homeschool partnership, and the third one, the parental representation. I don't want to go into too much detail, but there are a number of duties within the Act, and you can see them there in the boxes. Some of these entitlements for parents are that they should receive information and support to help them develop their child's learning at home and in the community. Schools must be open to the involvement of parents in the work that they do and consider ways of how they can provide information and help parents engage in their child's learning. The Act also provides that framework to ensure that parents have the opportunity to express their views. There is a whole range of different legislation and frameworks that cover this area of parental involvement, parental engagement, family learning and learning at home. We've just listed a few of them here just to some of the key documents for you. You'll be glad to hear I'm not going to talk about them all, but there just are a few that we would just pull out to your attention. You'll see the Act in the top left-hand corner of your screen or on the slide there. If you just kind of go to the diagonal there, you'll see Strategic Framework for Parental Involvement, Engagement, Family Learning and Learning at Home. That is a new document that was published back in October last year, and it aims to provide a streamlined approach that helps everybody that's working in this area to know and understand what they need to be aware of. So if you have a look at that document, it's on our National Improvement Hub. You'll see all the different areas of responsibility and legislative requirements. I would point your attention to section 5 of that particular document. We also have our Engaging Parents and Families Toolkit, which is down on the bottom of the slide. And again, there's 11 or 12 sections in there, and you're not meant to read through them all from start to finish, but just make your way through depending on what it is that you're wanting to work with in your setting or in your school. Just two other resources there, the British Sign Language Toolkit. Again, that is a new document which was published in October last year as well, and it's to help practitioners who are working with BSL families in their setting or school, and please take time to have a wee look through that. Also, if you are working with parent councils, we updated the Parent Council resource, and you'll see that just to the right of the BSL toolkit. So that's the sort of key documents I would highlight to that.
So there's a couple of documents that you should be aware of for family learning in particular. The first of these is the Adult Learning Statement of Ambition. This is an important document for those not familiar with adult learning and the impact that it can have, particularly for sectors whose primary focus would be children and young people. Because family learning, of course, includes the whole family, and there are specific skills involved in working with adults and children together. This document can provide some insight into how you support adults in particular. It's also good for schools, ELC settings, colleges, anyone not involved in the CLD world to know who can help support their families and what referral routes are available to them within the local authorities. The Higgins documents, as I'm sure you're all aware of, were refreshed in 2016 and more recently for CLD. In 2016, we conducted a series of consultation exercises with the field, and one of the requests was for an additional QI for family learning. So you'll find this QI in both the How Good Is Our School For and the Early Learning and Childcare. All of the documents were developed so that you can work across them. They have a common language, so can be used by partners from all sectors, which is great for anyone working in partnership because the workforce is so diverse when you engage with parents and families, and could include practitioners from schools, CLD, colleges, third sector. It's also important to note that this is a choice QI, but what we're seeing nationally from inspection findings is that year on year schools and ELC settings are increasingly using a family learning approach to engage their families in a learning outcome, which is positive. Next slide, Beverly.
So you'll see the third document in there is the review of learning at home. We published that back in 2018, and that came as a result of a review of the impact of the Parental Involvement Act, which was carried out by the National Parent Forum of Scotland in 2017. And one of the findings from that review was that there was a lack of clarity on what learning at home was and what it looked like in settings in schools. So you'll find that document also on the National Improvement Hub, and it looks at some of the research behind learning at home and the impact that it has, but it also has a definition of what learning at home has been agreed, the definitions agreed in Scotland.
So I'll just briefly talk about two of those documents. The first is the review that was conducted in 2016 at the same time as the Higgius refresh, and really took stock of where family learning was at that time. So what did the policy and strategy look like, research, and of course practice. One of the key features was the recommendations for Government, Education Scotland, local authorities and the research community. What practitioners wanted to include was a framework. So that's what we did. And the second document I want to draw your attention to is the framework. It's a how-to guide. It tells you what you should be taking into consideration when you're planning to deliver and evaluate family learning programmes. You're on mute, Pauline.
Had to happen at some point. What we're trying to do is almost give that wider context, because all of that is also relevant to your parents or children with additional support needs. But then we also have specific areas, and it's not about the individual documents or acts in a sense. It's just what are those key principles that we pull together. So I suppose one of the key ones is absolutely, as the wider documents say, we need parents involved and from as early as possible to build that partnership if we're going to get learning right for these children and young people. And they have the right to have a full opportunity to be involved in discussing their child's learning, decisions about their learning. And I suppose what the legislation is doing is acknowledging that parents do have this unique contribution in terms of their child's learning and their knowledge of the child, that 24-hour knowledge of the child. And for children with additional support needs, that's often crucial, because if we don't get both parts right, either end, either home or school, can suffer. And we, as part of the legislation, professionals do need to involve parents, take account of their views of their child's development, and to do that from the earliest point of view. But also the amended Act for additional support for learning also gave many of those rights to young people. So from 12 to 15, they have many of the same rights as their parents, and potentially they could come with different views. So it's just to remember that that's also part of the landscape. But what's very clear is that the local authority has to give due regard to children's views and also to the parental views. And parents do have a range of rights. And as we go into looking at best partnership, it's almost, sometimes it seems counterintuitive to arm people with rights, say about mediation, advocacy. You might be thinking, are we trying to create a conflict? But in fact, if we can give this support so that people know their rights, know how to be properly supported, we can actually have really much more fruitful dialogue. Sorry, my slide, the slide that I've got up isn't the same as the one that I've moved on to, but I'm not sure if there's a lag in time, but I'm on the one where there's bullet points. So they are, by right, have to be able to share their views about what they feel their child needs, have the views taken into account, have a supporter or an advocate present, but also way before that, they have the right to ask for an assessment and to find out if their child does have additional support needs. And additionally, that right around checking out, assessing whether the child needs a coordinated support plan. And finally, they also have the right, the policing rights as well. So there's a lot of things there to unpick, if you like. Okay. There has been a recent review, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I pulled out really what are the key themes when the additional support for learning review happened. Angela Morgan chaired that. They found that really a lot of the enactment of the additional support needs depended on very dedicated, skilled and inspiring professionals who care deeply about children and young people. but that it almost depended too much on that rather than a system where everyone was giving an equal, an equal quality of response. And I think that's reflected in the section where they put together what did parents say. So what they found was working, and I put that on the left, is that where leaderships, many could establish honest and trusting relationships between schools and parents. And what was involved there? Mutual listening and respect. And this then allowed a solid basis for sharing views and allowing for disagreement without necessarily conflict. And in my own work as a psychologist in schools, I didn't always, and the parents and I didn't necessarily, or myself in the school, we didn't always agree on the best plan in terms of placement or next steps. But that could be okay if people really felt listened to, heard, taken into account. That didn't necessarily mean consensus was always there, but it didn't necessarily need to bring conflict. And of course, when do we ourselves often feel our own hackles rising? It's when we don't feel heard. So many parents and carers during this review did share negative experiences of being disregarded, not listened to, or even more concerning, that they were being blamed for their child's behaviour. And they tended to feel that sometimes schools could differentiate between the worthy and the unworthy children with additional support needs. And that again obviously raised barriers. So sometimes they felt the child was only being seen as a problem. But I go back to the point that many very, very dedicated professionals are out there doing this work. But what we want is every parent having a similar, good quality experience. Okay. So they did come up with recommendations, which I have now, and really they are just about good communication, a willingness to listen and communicate, recognising the value of the knowledge that parents and carers have of their child, and that they are experts, along with the children themselves, in their own lives. Now, an example I would give you there, just to stop it being too academic or, unclear, one of the things that would typically happen with children with autism is that sometimes they are performing beautifully in school, masking the level of stress that's involved in them being able to give this performance. And then they go home and the parent is dealing with huge meltdowns, lacking of sleep, an very, very unhappy child. If the school's only taking into account what they see in front of them and not using that knowledge from the parent, then how can they get it right for that child? So that close partnership is absolutely crucial. And the other thing that they have sort of talked about is that there really needs to be a greater improvement in how we all work together around key points of transition. That was another sort of key one. They also brought out the benefits of mediation, and they feel that hasn't really been used well enough yet by parents and schools, and that could actually be a supportive mechanism that's there.
Okay, so this next slide is hopefully going to help clarify just some of the definitions that you'll hear us talking about throughout the presentation today. And there's 4 terms in particular. There's parental involvement, parental engagement, family learning, and learning at home. And we've just pulled them all together in this one slide just to help you see the differences and the synergies between the two. In addition to that, we've also we recognise that some people are visual learners, and so we did some work with our HM inspectors a couple of years ago now to draft up these sketch notes. You'll find them on our National Improvement Hub. They are beside the Family Learning Thematic Review that was carried out a couple of years ago. But if you do need a copy of them, please contact us and we'd be happy to send them out to you. We have them individually as well as in this, you know, sort of combined version. This next slide, and I hope they're keeping up with the system here. But this next slide is just again to help you to visualize the differences between parental involvement and parental engagement. And there is a continuum, a progressive continuum between the two, and the movement between them represents that shift between the relationship that the parent has with the parents to more of a focus on the relationship between the child and their child's learning. And you'll get that from Goodall and Montgomery. So it's the same information that we're giving you here about the definitions, it's just presented in a different format.
Okay, so we're going on to a section where we're going to use a Padlet, and we have a question that we would like you to consider and answer using the Padlet. So what we'll do is we'll pop the Padlet in the chat panel, and we would ask you to click on it and then just really think about, you know, what are the parental concerns in your setting or school in relation to additional support needs? Yep, Mrs. Mitchie, we can certainly, we'll be sending out the presentation, so you can either take it from that, or Beverly and I have actually cut them up as well, so that when we are talking about, for instance, parental engagement, we have that illustration, and then if it's family learning, we have that as well, so we can certainly send that out to you as well, if that's helpful. So what we'll do is I'm just going to try and get the Padlet link for you, and then if you just take about 5 minutes just to consider it, we're also happy for you to come back and we can have a wee chat amongst ourselves. Bear in mind, Kat is going to splice this, so it will be completely anonymous. So if you just take 5 minutes and go into the Padlet. Does anyone have any questions or comments just before you go in? You can either put them in the chat panel or just unmute yourself and we can have a conversation. I think everyone's probably busy with the Padlet.
I was going to say, I know one that it was a friend of mine who's a head teacher in a school without a language and communication unit. And one of the issues that she found was that perhaps her parents of children who attended the units weren't local to the school. So they weren't actually close by to come along to things because they were children who were transported to the school. So they never felt part of the life of the school as a whole.
I think, Beverly, there's probably some interesting stats that have come out of the Connect survey about the increase in parental engagement, in particular during COVID. And the reason for that was because it moved online. So it really broke down some barriers around families who, and quite a lot, in fact, that where the kids were transported in. So travel was definitely a barrier to participation. It would be interesting to see if we did another survey, what that would look like now.
Yeah. Can you see the Padlet? I've tried to share that.
Yep.
Because it's a little bit different from Jamboards where you get a sticky note, it is just the plus, which some of you have already found, that will let you add to it. So
you know, we work with national parenting groups, and one of the things that parents sometimes say is, you know, whenever a school phones, they get a bit tense because they always think there's something wrong. You know, it's never a conversation, you know, that's just about how are you doing. You know, they do get a bit tense. So I think one of the other comments was about one-to-one meetings being really important, and it's about how you structure those meetings as well.
I think that's a really good point about talking, introducing to parents and talking about the positives. Yeah, personal experience with your own children with the ASN. I think that's when you understand how it feels to be a parent of a child with an ASN, with the ASN, and how you feel. There's no point in constantly referring back to their difficulties, because we know what their difficulties are. It's more important that we look at how we're breaking down those barriers for the child and how we can work together.
And I think that a thread that's running through all of these is relationships. Mutual respect, collegiate relationships where people feel heard and understood.
I think that recognition that someone gave to the fact that many parents are coming with their own very negative experiences of schooling, fear, you know, it can actually take a huge amount of courage. And then if you're also, you know, feeling that, for example, if your child's not managing to cope in school and their behaviour has been an issue, then there can be shame involved too. There's so many layers really that can affect someone feeling comfortable being at the school.
I love those praise postcards. What are they? Is there? I don't know who it was that popped that in, but I don't know if you're able to just expand on that, because I haven't heard of that before.
I think someone's maybe going to type it in. If it's what I'm thinking of, you can buy, you can make them yourself, or you can buy them pre-made from various online retailers for educational purposes. And I used to have them as a head teacher, and it would be the head teacher says, you know, or a note from the head teacher, and I could just write it out like a postcard on the back. You know, Susan did a great job today, helping out in the lunchroom, or Susan was brilliant in the playground, something like that, and they can take it home. If that's the kind of thing that they're talking about. Yeah, so it sounds like it's the same thing.
Yeah, sorry, just on the first column, this third one down, somebody's put feedback from GIRFMEs. I don't know if that's a thing, an app, or...
It's a North Lanarkshire thing.
Is it?
In North Lanarkshire, it's called a GIRFME, and that's the planning tool for how you plan support for children with additional support needs. Obviously all done in relation to GIRFEC, but it's getting it right for me and the child, and the parents are involved in that.
Ah, so linking to Shinari, that's a good idea, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what
But-
it's all linked to.
There is actually
always sounds a bit.
There's an overlap here with one of the recommendations within the Angela Morgan Review, which is how do we make sure that all young people, including those with different learning barriers, are equally recognised? Because I think it is a painful thing for parents when they see other children being recognised and their own not recognised in the same way. So there's been quite a little bit of work from the Inclusion Ambassadors, who are a group of young people from across Scotland. It changes every year, who have a range of additional support needs, and who've given, they gave out awards this year for schools who had managed to celebrate achievement in its widest sense. But it is about sensitivity there. I remember someone I know getting sent along to get a special award and managed to get the non-resident parent to come. And it was for something like trying hard at PE. And this young girl was mortified that this was what she was up for. And so I think, we have to make sure that it's meaningful for that child, for that young person, that they want that publicly acknowledged. Maybe they are quite pleased to have done that, but they know in their eyes it's not a big thing and they do not want it publicly put out there. They were secondary age at the time. So again, it's probably, again, doing things in partnership, checking out, making sure that it's the right thing, because the intention was obviously good.
Okay, I think we could probably come back, and I think, Kat, what we can also do is pull that off as a kind of PDF if you want to attach it to the presentation. I'm also putting in some links for slide 10 and then slide 15, which I should have done. But I did not, and I apologise for that. But all the links that we're using, you'll be able to access once you get the presentation as well. So I think after slide 15, which is the Padlet, I think I am handing over to Pauline, who's going to go over, I believe it's Pauline.
This part
Sorry, it's just
will be
taking a wee
heavily just looking at the connect, the key themes.
Ah, right, okay.
Parents.
Sorry, just give me a second. It's just taking a wee minute to scroll back through. That's what I get for coming out of it.
Although it was nice to see the Padlet live, so thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone who participated as well. It's just good for us to reflect sometimes and then start thinking ahead about what we could do differently.
Okay, hopefully you can see that now. So this was a number of surveys that Connect, one of our national parenting organisations, had conducted, and they carried out their very first one. I think it was around about June of 2020, so it wasn't long after the COVID period had just sort of started for us and we all went into lockdown. So you can follow the progress from their website. I think there was about 4 or 5 different surveys that they carried out, and they still have each one of them there. And these are just some of the concerns and some of the positives that we've picked out across all of their surveys between 2020 and 2021. So the themes were consistent across the years in that COVID had a detrimental impact on children with additional support needs, and in particular their mental health. Parents didn't feel that children were always getting the support that they needed with their schoolwork. They felt that they needed additional support and that they weren't getting that, obviously because they weren't in a school setting in the school building. Some might have been, but not always. Some parents felt that their children were not engaging with their work at home. They found it quite difficult to get them to engage with that. Across Scotland, there was inconsistencies in the amount of work that was provided at home, and I don't think that was specific really to additional support needs. That would certainly seem to have been the case for many schools and for many parents. Learning at home was particularly challenging. We've talked about that. Some children did struggle to return to school after the long periods at home, and then being back into school and then back out again in lockdown, and they struggled with that. Some of the positives then, the online learning was a positive experience and very supportive for some children, and for other children the transition back to school after lockdown was easier. I don't have the statistics just now to tell you what that proportion was, but certainly do have a look in Connect's survey. You'll find it under their news page. And you'll get all of that feedback there. Next thing that we wanted to do was to have the results of a more recent survey. This was part of the national discussion, which I'm sure you're aware of, went on from September last year until December. The consultation is closed now, obviously, but in order to respond to that, Connect once more carried out a survey with parents to gather some information. And so we had a wee look at what that survey had said, what the findings were, and it's I guess encouraging to see that there are now more positives than what there were in the previous surveys. So if we start with them, children believe that parents have a right to know what they're learning so that they can help, and many children expressed that they wanted their parents involved in their and engaged in their children's learning and in the life of the school. And children expressed that they liked to see their parents in the setting in school and to know that they were in the building and around. Now, parents were saying that the school communication did work well. That was 68% of parents, and 70% of parents felt that there was a positive partnership between them and the school. The concerns then, parents of children with additional support needs would still like to be more involved, and they would also like to know more about what their child is learning and to have the progress on that learning on a more frequent basis. There was a feeling that staff maybe didn't have a lot of time to provide additional information for children who may benefit from it. It's not to say that they're not providing information, but it's maybe just that parents are looking for some more. But please do have a wee look around, Connect's question around that and get, the full extent of that information there, that feedback. Better planning and joined up work was required, and better communication with families of children with additional support needs. And you'll see I've put in the link there at the bottom so you can click in straight away and get that when you get a copy of the slides.
The other themes that we explored were those where the Inquire agency has a telephone contact number where parents phone in regularly, usually if they're either not able to find out information through the school or if they're struggling in some way. But what they found was most of the parents phoning up were parents of children with autism, so that probably helps us reflect a little bit. Are there maybe some groups of children rather than others who were maybe not quite getting it right for? But other parents where their child was displaying anxiety, ADHD, behavioural issues, dyslexia, speech or language delay, physical health conditions, or where they felt the learning environment or the child had a learning difficulty. So it was a wide range of parents. So the themes that emerged, and as you're listening to these, maybe start to think about your own setting and think, would a parent in my setting find that? Just start to make that, start to think about your own setting. So some of them were concerned about the level of support for their child. Was it enough? Others felt that they needed the school to work more on identifying and assessing the additional support needs, or they weren't sure how to request that. And others were just phoning up because they really didn't understand the nature of additional support needs, or maybe certain words had been used about their child's difficulties that they just hadn't followed. Others felt that the learning environment wasn't working for their children. For some, the main concern was meetings, either lack of them or how the meetings were being held. And I will go back to that when the Inquire give their sort of guidelines based on all of this information from parents. Communication was key too. For some of them, there'd been a breakdown in their relationship with the school, and obviously that impacted all areas. For others, they just weren't really convinced about whether this placement was the right placement, and they were looking to know more about what would the options be, how would they look for that. But for others, their concerns about education were wider than the school door, and certainly that, I think, is a theme where children are maybe well supported and included, and they're between the bells. But what about when there's extracurricular clubs, when there's residential trips or visits? Is their child's needs fully supported in those kinds of settings, or just even after school care not being as available? And that can be really tricky for parents to source that when their child maybe has a high level of need. And the other one there that was mentioned is children who are displaying emotionally based avoidance and are maybe refusing to go to school. That again is a key theme that's come back. And what was really concerning is that almost a third of the parents that Contact inquired, their children or young people were not attending school full time. And sometimes that was because of their anxiety, things not working for them. They were maybe on part-time timetables, or there was a significant group where they were unlawfully excluded and should have been in school but were not. The sort of go home and cool off, and we'll keep it all unofficial, which is unlawful. So quite a lot coming out from when Inquire looks at what parents bring to them. Okay.
Susan.
I just realised myself that I was on mute, sorry. So we like to use this slide to get us just to kind of pause for a wee minute. We've heard about some of our legislative duties, key documents that support us to engage with and understand the needs of our families and the communities that we all work in, which is great. But not all families will be able to engage with you, because for some, they will have barriers to participation. Now, in this slide that you see, there's a young person that's late for school because he's homeless, hungry, and either he or a family member is affected by ill health. It's amazing that he's actually made it to school in the first place. We need to know and understand barriers in order for us to effectively engage and retain families in any programme that we deliver. So in the next slide, Beverly's going to take us through and map out some of those barriers to participation.
So what we did was we looked at the barriers that we've seen across research and different reports and different reviews that had, identified barriers to engaging parents and families. So that's an 11-year period there. And I'm not going to read through them all, but you can see Hornby and Raphael 2011. There's 4 barriers were identified there. And by the time we get to the COVID barriers, there's quite a significant number in that column. None of these barriers have gone away. It was just parents are possibly just identifying more or are highlighting more barriers that's preventing them, or their situations have changed over time. What is interesting, and I haven't got it on this slide yet because I'm still waiting on the actual data, but the parental involvement and engagement census, which was carried out last year, they have published some initial findings in December. So you'll get that on Scottish Government's website. But the early indications from that is showing that work commitments is still the biggest barrier for parents. But if you take that and you break it down by age group, for the parents who have identified, what age bracket they come under, you'll see that in the, I think it's like the 24 to 35 age range, that the biggest barrier seems to be around a lack of confidence. So the more data that we're getting, the more we can try and understand what is actually happening for parents. So that data, I understand there's going to be a press release around that, but if you contact your own parental involvement officer within your area, then you can ask for the data, either the local authorities data or the parental involvement engagement census data, and just see what's happening in your area and see what parents have said. So that will help when we try to target those barriers. It helps us then to look at the parents that's in our setting in school and try to understand what age group that we're working with for parents and families. Cost was identified, and that seemed to be coming out from parents or grandparents who were older. So that again is an interesting thing to be thinking about. But please do make use of all these statistics when you get a hold of them.
Okay, so we're just going to use the chat pane or bring you into the conversation and just have a wee chat about what barriers currently exist in your setting or school when you do try to engage parents of children with additional support needs. I know we covered some of them in the Padlet, but it would be good to hear if there's any more that you can think of in relation to your setting or school.
Yeah, because I noticed language barrier, for example, was already.
Yeah. It's been interesting with the language barrier. We were engaging with a high school recently, and they had told us that there was something like 29 languages in that one school, which was a huge barrier, but they turned it into an opportunity to engage with parents to find out about their culture, kind of share that, which I think is really, really interesting, but obviously it is definitely a challenge, an additional piece of work for someone.
One of the things that I use, you see that point about shame and not feeling that your child is on par with, the peers in the class. One of the things that we used to do was, if you had a school disco or a school concert, we would try and bring those parents in, if they felt able and wanted to do it, to maybe be on the, the front desk taking tickets, or handing out programs, or helping with the teas and coffees. Just something that meant that they were maybe working closely with another parent who was probably on the parent council and willing to give up their time anyway of the school, so they would make an effort and talk to them and try and bring them into the school life, and which worked actually for some parents, especially parents who'd moved into the area. And then another thing, we were really lucky because it was a small community. There was a social enterprise in the village that it ran all sorts of bits and pieces, clubs, and like there was craft clubs for parents, for adults, that kind of thing. And we would reach out to them if we felt that parents maybe needed a wee bit of support integrating with others, which gave them the opportunity to have conversation. I filled that gap nicely.
Okay, well, it's maybe something that people can just sort of add into the chat pane if we want to move on to the next slide.
We've got feedback there from someone saying because of previous bad experiences of not being heard, that in itself was a barrier. So then having to try and meet face to face or a phone call to rebuild, I think that's important. And I think that preemptive work as well that's talked about before you're having to address an issue, if you can have dialogue, build things up gently so that you're not coming in that the first sort of one-to-one chat is a serious one where you're maybe raising concerns. I think Mrs. Ali's about to put something in as well.
And just to add on to what Mrs. Mitchie has said about that rebuilding relationships and trust, a lot of times if you don't have those relationships and give yourself time to build those relationships, barriers to participation will never be divulged to you because some of them are really, really personal to the families. So I think that's important to note as well. Yeah, definitely language.
Yeah. Something I've reflected on, I had the good fortune to be on the Building Racial Literacy programme, the second cohort, and one of the areas that they explored were, came up was children from Gypsy traveller families, and the fact that they've been a group who historically have been really difficult to engage. And I suppose I had stopped at that point, just being aware that that's a group that's hard to engage. And I was very aware when I worked in Perthshire for a while, there was a lot of rural poverty, second generation settled travellers, but the poverty was really sort of high. But what I'd never thought about was the fact that not many generations ago, many children were separated from families of Gypsy travellers and sent to schools and basically taken into care, and that this was quite widespread in Scotland. And I think maybe sometimes we think of these things happening in Canada with Indigenous families and so on, and we're not thinking about the history. So if that history goes through generationally as with those fears, with that trauma, then is it any wonder that at this stage? But we've actually on our website, we've got an example of Oban High School who decided that they would look specifically at that area because they had a lot of settled travellers in their catchment area. And traditionally they would go to school in primary, but not in secondary. And if you want to have a look at that on the hub, really what they did was really start with where the families were at. The families were willing to meet the staff outside school, but not inside school. So they found a neutral place where they could all meet together. Very, very gradually, they allowed their children to test the water by going into a support base for one particular subject. I think it was home economics because they wanted to develop their cooking. The children themselves identified they'd like to develop IT because often that's a big barrier. Those families are not necessarily linked up. So they started that. So I think you might find it fascinating if you look at that particular case study, just to see very, very gently. And they only got to a certain point because then there was other barriers that the families felt they couldn't take any further step, but they became a partnership. And I think that's what shines through in that example. Okay, moving on to thinking about what did Inquire recommend. We do have a link to the recommendations, but I tried to summarise them. Sorry, if you could go back, I've summarised them in that page. So first of all, they recommend that you really start by making sure parents and carers have a good understanding of their rights in this area. So for example, thinking about your school, do you have easily available leaflets, things on your website where a parent that's just beginning to think, I wonder if my child's reading progress is normal, or do you think they might have dyslexia? Just say that those beginning thoughts, they haven't talked to someone because they don't know if they're being daft or if they're over worrying, then can they easily access any information about that? Maybe a little video. Have you got a concern about your child's learning? A little video where the school explains what your next step would be, because we can't assume that people know. Also the fact that they have the right, for example, to bring somebody along to a meeting. If that's not explained, people maybe don't know that's possible, and that can actually be hugely helpful, because again, if you're anxious, you go away. Any of us can think about this with doctor's appointments, or where we've taken a parent along, where when we know they're anxious, they'll miss half the information, they'll come out and they'll say, I've no idea what's happening. And actually, you can imagine as a school lead, you've maybe gone into lots of detail, but because that person's in fight or flight, they leave without virtually all of the message that you've given them. So that, again, is really, really helpful. Emphasising that we're all wanting the same thing for this child. We all want them to flourish. So starting from that shared goal rather than from any differences. Supporting involvement, we talked about language barriers, so where it's possible, an interpreter, ideally, obviously, not the child being given that role because of all the other issues around that. Preparing families, this can be quite patchy. My main sort of litmus test for a meeting is that when a family came and it was about their child and their additional support needs, no new information should be getting shared at the meeting for the first time. So you actually have to have prep time with the family to make sure that everything that's going to be suggested or discussed they're already aware of. And that can really make a huge difference. Again, it doesn't mean you'll all agree, but it does mean people aren't caught out in a very highly emotional way and therefore not able to take part. Support, I thought these were really helpful, things like how the system works. For example, many parents are asking for an additional adult, or maybe further down the line, the school's talking about the pupil support assistant being reduced, starting to help them understand why that might be, starting to talk about how we try to work towards independence and autonomy for the child. And I love this one, listening to understand and not to reply. I had a recent situation with someone in a placement and I had a particular concern about their safety. And what was really obvious is they were sort of hurrying me along so that they could reply, rather than just staying with the person's fears and concerns, which is very, very hard when you know you're about to go on lunch duty 5 minutes later. So I'm not suggesting that's easy. But if we don't feel that someone's listening to understand, then obviously there's a reaction. Jargon, like every sector, we are full of jargon and we won't even be aware half the time which bits. So maybe that's a helpful question to put in. Do you know, during this meeting, I've probably said some words, we're terrible at it, that I haven't explained. Can you think of any? Or you might suggest one and say, I just remember I said this means so-and-so. Was there anything else? So inviting that it's actually okay not to know this peculiar system that we all know as a parent. Then the other thing they suggest, very helpful, following up with a summary, a timeline, and who's going to do what. Because sometimes that isn't always done, and yet it's very obvious good practice. Okay. So we're going to give an example where we think there is something that's out there just now, free for schools, that can help with some of those areas. So some of you may be aware of, or maybe even been along to some of our work around the Circle framework, which was trialled and developed in Edinburgh, Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh City Council. It involved many teaching staff. It involved children, parents, looking at what do we need to know in terms of supporting children to be included and to have their additional support needs addressed. So they developed a framework which looks at the skills that children need, what supports their motivation, what the importance of structures and routine, and the importance of the environment. And it's based on a mix of research about inclusion, teacher evidence, which is also absolutely relevant because it isn't always in research where you get all the information, but that teacher professionalism and knowledge that's built up over the years. So that's included in it. So just to give you an example of how that might help from a parental point of view, we've got two teachers. They're both from primary, but it is used in secondary as well and in early years. So we've got two different staff members talking about how it supported them in terms of supporting families where the children have additional support needs. And hopefully this will come up with the sound on. So the first one's a deputy head speaking about how she found it has helped partnership working. There is a link for our Improvement Hub page, which gives all access to all Circle manuals. Sorry.
Framework to talk to with parents. Parents are not always aware of all the strategies that teachers naturally put in place on a daily basis. So it's really good to be able to identify those strategies and to have that conversation with the parents to say, this is what we've tried, this is what it's worked, this is what maybe hasn't worked. And if we do need to go beyond the classroom for support, for example, involving partner agencies, it helps the parents to understand why, so that they are part of that journey with you and they don't feel that it's being done to their child, but they're actually with you on that journey to make sure that everything has been put in place to help their children.
I think she makes a really important point there, and that's certainly in my professional capacity as a psychologist. Often schools are so used to amending their curriculum and adjusting for children that they don't even think to share those particular aspects of their work with the parents, because for them it's just bread and butter, adjusting your teaching and learning to make it work for the child. And I would maybe have a parent coming to myself saying, they've done nothing for my child. And I've actually sat with a class teacher hearing all the adjustments that had been made and what had worked and what hadn't worked. And so that breakdown in communication, I think that there's certainly something there where when they fill out the environment scale, they can show how they've adjusted their classroom to best meet the wider needs of the children. But then there's also something called the participation scale, where they look at all the adjustments they're making for the individual child. And that, again, just allows a dialogue and it helps parents understand what's been possible. And then for the parents and the schools together to decide, are they on the right track? So now we've got Louise Elric, a head teacher's going to speak, and we've actually got that as audio. Just again, a couple of minutes saying how she felt it worked for her school. We've been thinking about how we support parents with when their child has an additional support need. And I wondered what you felt in terms of how Circle had maybe enhanced your relationship with parents, or did it change the dynamics? So just your thoughts on that while people put in some thoughts.
Very much so. We're really fortunate here at Headleyburn that we've got a family learning worker that's associated with our school. So I think what Circle has done for us was, especially with the environment, the structures and routines, quite often if children with additional support needs are signalling through their behaviour, is because there's something wrong with their environment or structured routines. So what we were almost able to do was kind of use our family learning worker to mirror that home-school relationship. So this is what we're trying and this is what we're exploring at school. This is the things that we're seeing. Are you seeing the same things at home? And it was really able to kind of support that holistic view and that joined up dialogue, because there might be similar things at home, there might not, there might have been completely different things. So I think it really supported that joint up thinking. I think it supported that transparency and that openness that we were actually viewing their child through a different lens, if that made sense, because I think quite often, especially we've got quite a few children who are on the autism spectrum, and I think their parents sometimes feel that we perhaps don't understand their sensory needs. But what we were actually able to do was Circle provided that evidence base that this is what we're seeing and this is the actions that we're taking. So yeah, absolutely do think it's kind of facilitated those relationships and that understanding.
Okay. One of the other things that Circle offers, both at the primary and the secondary level, is postcards from school to home, but also where the home can send ideas to the school. So if you think about all those Connect surveys where people are saying, I want to be involved in their learning, but I don't even know what they're learning all the time, obviously a school can't give a blow-by-blow of every area. But if you've worked together and decided on specific aspects that you're really going to focus on through the Circle framework, then you can then say, here's something we're trying just now that we hope will meet that need, whether it's skills or motivation, whatever it might be. And then they can also suggest something that can be tried at home. I think any suggestions have to be very lightly offered, because sometimes if it's more a directive, we want you to do A, it's just another opportunity. Sometimes families feel to fail and feel shame. Whereas if you can say, we're trying this and this, we're wondering if it might be helpful to try blah. So it's very much offered as a possibility, because only the family know their setting and only they know how their child reacts in the home setting. But as you can see, it's mirrored where the home can say, we've done A, B or C, this has been really going quite well, and this is what we would try. The other thing I popped up, just so you can really look at it afterwards, is examples of what they gave from all the feedback from teachers about collaboration with partners. And of course, partners include both the parents and the learners as partners. So again, many of the themes there are similar to relates, and they might be something where maybe you have a collegiate time with your other members of staff after this, and you start a discussion. Look, here are some of the key themes that we know are important for good partnership. Do we feel those are working? Not all of them are relevant to parents, but most of them are. So hopefully that might potentially be a helpful resource there as well. Okay.
So I've just put up one case study. We have a number of case studies on our National Improvement Hub, but I've just put up one which I thought might be of interest to you, and it is regarding work that one school in particular has done with parents who have a child that uses British Sign Language, or indeed the parent uses British Sign Language and that their child is a hearing parent. So you'll find that on our National Improvement Hub, and I've put the link in there, but please do have a look around the hub, and you can filter it by topic. So if you're looking for something parental engagement, you can filter by that, or family learning, you can filter on that as well. So.
Okay, we've kind of come to the end of our session, and we do have some further reading for you, and you're going to get 15 minutes back, which is great. Now, we do encourage people to, when they leave, obviously, the sessions, look over the presentation, and if you do have time, we would encourage you to look at some of the further reading. The ones we have here is the review of best practice in family engagement, advice for professionals from Inquire. There is a piece of research, which is a longitudinal piece of research from Gail MacLeod and Lynn Tett, and it's focused in Scotland, actually, in Edinburgh. So it really looks at how utilising a family learning approach or family learning workers to increase parental engagement can be really beneficial, not just for school and home communication, but also for building the capacity of the parent and supporting those increased relationships with parent and teacher, or head teacher, or named person, whoever that is. So that's a good piece of reading, and obviously research is something that we should all be looking at as a kind of foundation to our practice. And then the last one is the Circle resource that Pauline has mentioned. So we would encourage you to have a look at those, utilise them in your work. And I do believe the next slide is really just our contact details.
does anyone have any questions related to what you've heard today, or to the Circle resource, for example, just before we
go off,
to
ladies?
this? Yeah.
Before we go into that, what I will say is I'm just going to say thank you very much to everybody, and I will stop the recording.